Back in 1856, workers mining limestone in Germany's Neander Valley stumbled upon something unexpected: fossilized bones. Initially, they mistook them for a bear's remains, but these bones held a secret that would rewrite history. They belonged to our closest known relatives. Now, over 400,000 years ago, a fascinating species of humans, quite different from us, and some might say even more advanced, emerged from an ancestor known as Homo heidelbergensis. These were the Neanderthals, remarkably intelligent beings with brains on average larger than ours. They thrived across vast territories from the Mediterranean to Siberia, interacting with our ancestors. But here's where it gets a bit more interesting. Despite the Neanderthals' success about 40,000 years ago, they mysteriously disappeared along with all other species alive at the time, leaving only one human species remaining. Why did they vanish while we, Homo sapiens, not only survived but thrived to dominate the planet? You know, just like the dinosaurs, the Neanderthals faced a fate they couldn't foresee. But unlike the dinosaurs, their extinction wasn't a sudden cataclysmic event, like a massive meteorite strike from space. It was more like a slow fade, a gradual unraveling of the world they knew so well, a world that once welcomed them but eventually turned against them, making their very existence impossible. Neanderthals lived through the ups and downs of the last ice age, a time marked by dramatic swings between cold and warmer periods. Archaeological evidence suggests that particularly harsh cold snaps often coincided with declines in Neanderthal populations. These extreme weather events likely caused major changes in vegetation, turning the open woodlands Neanderthals preferred into less welcoming environments. This shift would have significantly impacted the populations of large herbivores, like mammoths and woolly rhinos, that Neanderthals relied on for food. With the landscape and availability of essential resources constantly changing, Neanderthals likely struggled to adapt, leading to shrinking populations and the resulting challenges that come with that. Sure, Neanderthals were great at hunting large Ice Age animals, but sometimes being too specialized can be a disadvantage. When the climate changed and some of these animals went extinct, Neanderthals may have found themselves more vulnerable to starvation. On top of that, Homo sapiens might have had a competitive edge. There's evidence that early Homo sapiens had long-distance trade networks, which could have helped them cope better during times of climate change when their preferred foods were scarce, something Neanderthals didn't have. So, between the changing climate and increasing competition from Homo sapiens, it seems likely that these factors together led to the extinction of Neanderthals, leaving us as the last human species standing on the planet. Meanwhile, about 300,000 years ago, the earliest Homo sapiens communities began emerging in Africa. They didn't resemble modern humans as we know them today, but they were closer to us than any other Homo species. Their skulls were tall and rounded, with almost vertical foreheads, unlike the Neanderthals with their heavy brows or other archaic-looking Homo species like Homo with their protruding jaws. These early sapiens had distinct features, including chins, a trait unique to our species. As for when Homo sapiens went out of Africa, that's still a topic of debate. Genetic evidence hints at a major migration out of the continent between 80,000 and 60,000 years ago, but that might not have been the first time. There's a puzzling Homo sapiens skull discovered in Epidamia, Greece, dated to at least 210,000 years old, suggesting that our ancestors might have been exploring beyond Africa much earlier than previously thought. It's pretty fascinating to think about all the different Homo groups besides Neanderthals that were hanging around between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, right alongside us Homo sapiens. Some of them were pretty similar to us, like the mysterious Denisovans making do in the high-altitude regions of what we now call Siberia and Tibet, and who knows, maybe even farther out. Then there's Homo erectus, the traveler of the bunch, striding through parts of Indonesia with its long legs, earning it the nickname cosmopolitan, Over in China, you had Homo longi, also known as the Dragon Man, and down in Central and Southern Africa, you had Homo rhodesiensis, or Homo soloensis, or maybe even Homo heidelbergensis, depending on who you ask, making its mark. But let's not forget the ones that really stood out from the crowd, us. Take Homo naledi, for example, with its small ape-like brain which roamed the wooded grasslands of South Africa. There was also the tiny Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis, who lived on the islands of Flores and Luzon in Indonesia and the Philippines, respectively. However strange it may seem, all these hominin species were probably coming and going all the time, and to be honest, it is actually kind of surprising that we're still here. Now, when it comes to ancient humans, the fossil record can be pretty spotty. Homo naledi, for instance, is known only from one site in South Africa. Many other species are known from just a handful of individuals. Even in Africa, where Homo sapiens first appeared, there are surprisingly few Homo fossils, and we actually don't have a very good understanding of what other hominins were on the landscape in Africa with Homo sapiens yet. On the flip side, we have a wealth of information about Neanderthals, including complete genomes extracted from their bones. This wealth of data gives us incredible insights into their lives and how they interacted with their environment and with us. Neanderthals were kind of like humans, but with some noticeable differences. They had these prominent brows, faces that stuck out more, and rib cages that were shorter, deeper, and wider than ours. Plus, their eye sockets were way bigger, though we're not entirely sure if their vision was different from ours. Now, when it comes to brains, Neanderthals had ones about the same size as ours, but they were more elongated. There's still a lot of debate among researchers about the exact size and structure of Neanderthal brains, but they generally agree that the average Neanderthal dude was around 5'4", while the lady stood at about 5 feet. Now, these differences in skull shape between Neanderthals and us aren't just superficial. They actually have some pretty interesting cognitive implications. Things like their smaller parietal lobes and cerebellum are all tied to using tools, understanding space, doing math, being creative, and thinking about complex ideas. Even though these differences might seem small, they could have played a big role in natural selection and maybe even helped explain why Neanderthals and modern humans had different social behaviors, tech skills, and artistic talents. Back in the day, when scientists first started finding Neanderthal bones, some actually thought they were our ancestors, but as more evidence piled up and got analyzed, it turned out that wasn't quite the case. See, the lines that led to Neanderthals and us split off from each other more than 800,000 years ago, and they went their separate ways, literally. Our human story starts in Africa, while Neanderthals were the true natives of Eurasia. So yes, we might have shared the planet, but our paths were definitely our own. Excavations have shed a lot of light on Neanderthals, giving us a much clearer picture of who they were. These folks lived a lifestyle heavily centered around hunting large animals like mammoths, elephants, and woolly rhinoceroses. They lived in small groups and used tools like spears to catch their prey. Their diet was mostly meat, but they also ate plants. This flexibility shows they adapted their diet based on what was available in different environments and seasons. There's also evidence that sometimes they practiced cannibalism. But here's the thing. They weren't so different from us after all. They were making tools, wearing clothes, controlling fire, and even burying their dead just like we do. There's a chance that they were into music too. They also had some genetic similarities with us, like mutations in the forkhead box protein P2, FOXP2 gene, which is linked to language. However, whether they were chatting away like us is still up for debate. They also engraved symbols on cave walls in Europe long before modern humans set foot on the continent. Now, as for the whole cannibalism thing, it seems like it might have been more ritualistic than just about finding dinner, like how different cultures have their own rituals around food. But let's just say some Neanderthals got a taste of their own medicine by being eaten by our ancestors, But even if our ancestors occasionally ate Neanderthals, it doesn't mean we were the ones who wiped them out in one big feast. The thing is, Neanderthals were pretty well adapted to cold climates with their big noses that helped warm up chilly air and their sturdy bodies that kept the heat in. But you know what they say? Sometimes being good just isn't enough. It seems like Homo sapiens might have had a slight edge over them. I mean, think about it. Early Homo sapiens had some solid technology that Neanderthals didn't, like sewing needles for making clothes. And let's face it, a well-sewn tent means better insulation, which is crucial for keeping warm, especially for little ones. On top of that, Homo sapiens had some amazing tools like bows and arrows and a more varied diet compared to Neanderthals. Now, there's no solid proof of an all-out brawl between the two species. But remember how we mentioned earlier that Neanderthals and our ancestors had occasionally mated? Well, some people speculate that those romantic encounters might have played a role in Neanderthals' downfall. And you might even find it funny how a few moments of pleasure could have such big consequences. So, it's possible that infectious diseases carried by Homo sapiens were passed on to Neanderthals. Now, Neanderthals didn't have much defense against these new infections, which they hadn't encountered before. This could have had some pretty devastating effects on Neanderthal communities. On the flip side, Homo sapiens were a bit harder when it came to diseases. Part of it was because they had evolved to deal with a lot more diseases, especially those found in tropical regions. Plus, there were simply more Homo sapiens around, so even if there were some serious outbreaks, there were still enough survivors to keep the population going. Now, if viruses could easily hop between these two similar species, especially if they were living in close proximity, it's possible that Homo sapiens inadvertently passed on diseases to Neanderthals. And because there weren't as many Neanderthals around, these infections could have wreaked havoc on their numbers. This whole process might also explain why Homo sapiens were pretty resilient to Neanderthal diseases and parasites. It's like a game of biological tag, where new human diseases likely made their way from Africa into Eurasia. This African advantage stuck around until about 10,000 years ago when the agricultural revolution happened in Eurasia. Suddenly, domesticated animals became the main source of new infections, flipping the script to give Eurasians the upper hand in disease resilience. If you want an example of just how devastating Eurasian viruses could be, just look at the historical impact they had on Native American populations. It gives us a glimpse into how Homo sapiens might have affected their hominin cousins in Eurasia around 40,000 years ago. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Homo sapiens might have assimilated their Neanderthal and Denisovan cousins into their gene pool. There's some pretty solid genetic evidence backing this up. For instance, some people today, especially in Eurasia, carry around 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genes. And it's not just Neanderthals. Populations in Oceania have between 2% and 4% Denisovan DNA, with some groups even having more. But there's still a bit of a mystery surrounding another unknown human ancestor who contributed a chunk of their genetic makeup to people living in West Africa today. However, here's a new theory that's been making the rounds lately. It suggests that Neanderthals might have had some characteristics that set them apart from us modern humans, and these differences could have played a role in their decline. Now, we're talking about clues from both their bodies and the stuff they left behind that hint at the idea that Neanderthals weren't as good at organizing themselves socially as we are. And in times when resources were scarce, that could have been a real problem. But here's another surprise. When it comes to certain genes related to behavior, Neanderthals didn't have as much variety as us. Specifically, they had fewer versions of genes linked to traits like hyperactivity and aggressiveness. Could these genetic quirks explain why Neanderthals behaved differently, and maybe not in a way that helped them survive? It's a bit of a mystery. We don't know how these gene variations actually affect behavior, so it's hard to draw any solid conclusions. However, scientists, as you would expect, aren't giving up, and they are actually trying something new. introducing these Neanderthal and Homo sapiens gene versions separately into mice to see what happens. This is basically a genetic experiment in progress, and it'll be years before we have any real answers. But what do you think about all of these theories? Did the Neanderthals simply lose the race of the survival of the fittest? Or is there some form of foul play involved here? Share your thoughts using the comments section, and if you love all things prehistory, subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.